It began during the Cold War and continues to this day, a battle for control of our minds that rages across humanity, largely unseen but orchestrated by global superpowers, Russia, China, the United States, the left and the right, in ways that may surprise you. Cultural backgrounds are exploited to sway our emotions towards fear, desperation, hope, unity, or division, debilitating enemies or strengthening alliances. It is an ongoing clash of titans in which every single one of us is just a mere pawn. From mundane propaganda tactics to the weaponization of psychics, nothing has been too French for either side to attempt. And believe me, as we go into this deep dive, things are going to get weird and ridiculous. And to understand the genesis of this mental battleground, we need to visit the source of all evil. Who else? Nazi Germany. So stay with me to go over a little bit of history and give you some context on all this madness. Hitler's Third Reich engaged in horrifying activities in their pursuit of human perfection and global dominance. And deep within their labs and concentration camps, German scientists venture into dark territories, crossing the boundaries between legitimate experimentation and outright sadism, between medical research and sheer madness. Some of their work was rooted in real science, while other aspects were nothing more than grotesque cruelty disguised as research. Together, these endeavors planted the seed of paranoia that would eventually flourish into the Cold War. It is a grim and unsettling fact that great advancements in medical knowledge emerged from these atrocities, from cancer treatments and neurological diseases to genetics and psychiatric phenomena. However, these developments were often twisted, serving not to heal but to diagnose and kill all individuals not suited in creating the so-called perfect Aryan German. This dark pursuit gave credibility to pseudoscientific and paranormal experiments, including studies on telepathy, telekinesis, mind control, remote viewing, and even remote assassination techniques. Disturbingly, their exploration of fringe science was conducted with even a more ruthless disregard for human life. The Nazis wanted to know how much the human body could endure, how far the mind could be pushed, and they wanted results fast, without ethics and without restraint. At Dachau, prisoners were immersed in tanks of icy water or left naked in the snow. Their temperatures was recorded as their bodies shut down. Doctors timed how long they survived before death, then tried various methods of revival, scalding baths, open flames, even sexual intercourse forced with female prisoners. The justification was military. Luftwaffe pilots were being shut down in the North Sea. If a pilot bailed out over water, how long could he survive? How should he be revived? But the reality was sadism cloaking necessity. Survivors described screams echoing through the barracks at night, men begging to be pulled from the water, only to be pushed back down with poles. In other experiments, victims were locked in pressure chambers, simulating high-altitude flights. Air was sucked away until their lungs collapsed. Some convulsed violently, their eyes bursting. The goal was to learn how high pilots could fly without oxygen, and whether sudden decompression could be survived. These reports later reached Allied investigators. Reading them in 1945, American officers were horrified, but also intrigued. The data was grotesque, but it was also unique. Real scientific findings, but with lives. And no one else had it. On other camps, prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, or hepatitis. Doctors injected them with chemical cocktails testing cures and vaccines. Most died, others were deliberately starved, fed on nothing but potato broth or seawater to see how long the body could last. These experiments were not just about biology, they were about control. If a substance could make a soldier fight longer, endure more, or reveal secrets under stress, it could be a weapon. Among the strangest experiments was the Nazi fascination with mescaline. At Dachau, SS doctors administered the hallucinogen to prisoners, then interrogated them. They wanted to know, could psychedelics break the human will? Could a truth drug make an enemy reveal secrets he would otherwise die to protect? Some prisoners broke down, rambling incoherently. Others screamed as visions overcame them. The results were inconclusive, but the seed was planted. Decades later, the CIA would run MK Ultra, dosing subjects with LSD in the hope of finding the same key the Nazis sought: control of the human mind. The Nazi state was also the world's largest drug cartel. the Wehrmacht distributed millions of pervitamin tablets, pure methamphetamine, to its soldiers. Marches that should have been impossible were completed in days. The blitzkrieg itself was fueled by chemistry. But in the camps, doctors experimented with extreme dosages. Some prisoners were given meth until their hearts burst. Others were forced to fight each other under its influence, observed like lab rats. Cocaine, morphine, and barbiturates were also tested, sometimes mixed in nightmarish combinations. These were not medical studies, they were explorations of domination. How to keep men awake until collapse, how to numb them to fear, how to bend the will to the Reich. Joseph Mengele's obsession with genetics drove him to test not only twins but also families. Twins were subject to cruel procedures. One would be injected with disease, dissected alive or mutilated, while the other was monitored for reactions. Mengele testing for a kind of telepathic link. Survivors claim he wanted to know if pain inflicted to one of the twins could be felt by the other. Mothers were told their infants would be tested for instinctive connections. Brothers were forced into isolation to see if they could sense each other's suffering. There is no evidence these experiments produced results, but the whispers of them filter into post-war intelligence files. The idea that the Nazis had at least searched for the psychic bond made American and Soviet officers wonder, what if they had found something? It may sound absurd today, but in the 1940s the idea of extrasensory perception was treated with strange seriousness by elements of the Nazi elite. Himmler's SS was obsessed with the occult. A research institute under his control funded studies in telepathy, astrology, and even runic magic. From expeditions to Tibet in search of mystical origins to impossible religions myths like the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, the SS blurred mysticism and science until they were undistinguishable. The Reich ideology thrived on myth, and myth demanded experiments, no matter how cruel. And then they were the wonder weapons. The Nazi records veer into the bizarre. Among the strangest legends is that of the Die Glocke, the bell, described as a massive bell-shaped device housed in a secret facility in Lower Silesia. The machine allegedly emitted powerful radiation, killed plants and animals nearby, and may have been an attempt at anti-gravity propulsion. According to post-war accounts, the bell was tested near the facility called Der Ries. It was said to contain two counter-rotating cylinders filled with a mercury-like substance called cerium-525. When activated, the device glowed violet and distorted time and space. Most historians believe the Die Glocke is a myth, first popularized by journalist Igor Witkowski in the 1990s. But like all Nazi myths, it endures because it is possible to imagine the Reich reaching for it. The Nazis had already pioneered the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, the synthetic fuels, why not anti-gravity? And if the bell existed, if even fragments of its design survived, who got to it first? The Americans or the Soviets? Not all Nazi weapons were myths. Some were very real and decades ahead of their time. Walter and Raymar Horton were aviation prodigies. In 1944 they produced the HO-229, a jet-powered flying wing. Its sleek bat-like silhouette wasn't like any aircraft of the day. It was faster, flew higher, and stealthier than anything the Allies had. The war ended before it could be mass-produced, but the design lived on. Captured blueprints and prototypes were shipped to the United States. Engineers at Northrop studied them, and decades later, echoes of the HO-229 can be seen in the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. But in 1944, when Allied pilots glimpsed strange shapes in the sky, or when villagers reported aircraft with no tails, the line between real and impossible blurred. Were these German planes or something otherworldly? By the time Berlin fell, the Reich had left a graveyard of horrors. Real rockets that reached space, real aircraft that look alien, rumors of anti-gravity machines, testimonies of psychic experiments on twins and families, piles of documents on drugs and chemical mind control substances. No one knew how much of it was true, but in the chaos of 1945, truth mattered less than possibility. The United States and the Soviet Union both scrambled to seize Nazi science, and with it, Nazi myths, because in the coming Cold War, a rumor could be just as powerful as a bomb. By the spring of 1945, the promise of a German empire of 1,000 years had burned out in 12. But in the ruins of its labs, rocket sites, and concentration camps, the victors found something they wanted to keep: knowledge. And so, in those chaotic last weeks, a second war began for the minds behind the knowledge. In the United States, it was given an innocent name: Operation Paperclip. In the beginning of 1945, American intelligence officers had recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Many were former members of the Nazi Party. Some had worked in facilities powered by slave labor. But Washington looked past that. What mattered was what they knew. At the top of the list was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and ambitious rocket engineer behind the V2. Von Braun had joined the Nazi Party and worn an SS uniform. But to the Americans, he was too valuable to lose. Along with his team, he was whisked out of Germany before the Soviets could claim him. Von Braun and his men would go on to design the Redstone missiles, the Jupiter rocket, and finally the Saturn V that carry astronauts to the moon. But he was not alone. Kirk DeVos, another Nazi engineer, became the first director of NASA Kennedy Space Center. Arthur Rudolph, once in charge of the V2 production at the underground Middlework factory, became project director of the Saturn V. Their past were stained with war crimes, but in America, they were given new papers, new lives, government salaries. The Cold War had no room for morality. It only had room for victory. The Soviet Union, too, hunted for German scientists. In the Eastern Zone, Red Army officers raided labs, seizing blueprints and equipment. Entire factories were dismantled, packed into crates, and shipped to Moscow. Hundreds of engineers and technicians were forced to work in the Soviet Union. Among them were experts in rocketry, jet propulsion, and chemical weapons. Their knowledge became the foundation for the Soviet missile program. The Soviets did not get von Braun, but they captured his facilities. The V2 rockets left behind at Peenemünde were shipped east, and with them came fragments of documentation, tested data, and parts that Soviet engineers reverse engineered. One of the most important figures was Sergei Korolev, the brilliant Soviet engineer who turned captured German technology into the R-7 rockets, the missiles that would launch Sputnik, the world's first satellite. For the Soviets, the V2 was not just a weapon, it was a stepping stone to space. But the Americans and the Soviets weren't just racing for rockets, they were racing for rumors. Every time a scientist disappeared into the other side's custody, fear spread. What did they take? What are they hiding? If the Americans captured von Braun, maybe the Soviets had captured the Horton brothers and their flying wing designs. If the Soviets carry away boxes of documents, maybe they included research on telepathy, psychedelic truth serums, on devices like the Dia Cloque. The paranoia was endless because the truth was unknowable. Neither side could be certain what the other had seized, and in that uncertainty, myths grew. In Washington, generals whispered that the Soviets might have psychic researchers taken from Mengeles camps in Moscow, and the Politburo feared the Americans had inherited Nazi anti-gravity experiments. Most of it was fantasy, but in the Cold War, fantasy could not be ignored. If there was even 1% chance the enemy had it, you had to assume it was real. And the American public was never told the truth about Paperclip. Officially, the US denied that he had brought Nazis to American soil. The files were classified. The scientists were given sanitized biographies. It wasn't until decades later that the truth emerged, that men who had overseen slave labor and atrocities were working for NASA, that the American space program was built in part on the backs of prisoners who had died digging tunnels for the V2 factories. This morale compromise became a template. In the Cold War, morality was always the first casualty. What mattered was beating the Russians. In 1945, America had something no one else did: the atomic bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved its power. For 4 years until 1949, the US held a monopoly in nuclear terror. But that monopoly created its own paranoia. If the Soviets could not match America's bomb, what could they try instead? This is where Nazi science cast its longest shadow. If Stalin had inherited even a fragment of the Reich's more exotic research, He could terrify America without ever testing a bomb. And so, when strange lights appeared in the skies over New Mexico in 1947, when debris were found in fields outside Roswell, the question was not just aliens. It was, is this what the Soviets got from the Nazis? By the end of the 1940s, the stage was ready. America had rockets, Nazi engineers, and the atomic bomb. The Soviets had their own scientists, captured factories, and a hunger to catch up. Both sides had inherited not just hard science, but a library of whispers about psychic twins, psychedelic serums, anti-gravity machines, and flying wings that looked like saucers. Neither side knew which of those whispers were true, and so both acted as if they all might be. The war for Nazi science was over, and the Cold War of myths was just beginning, and it would explode into public view in the desert of New Mexico, at Roswell. By 1945, the Second World War was over, but the world was not at peace. It was fractured into East and West, freedom and capitalism against oppression and socialism. And at the center of this fracture stood the most terrifying weapon ever built, the atomic bomb. The United States had it, the Soviet Union did not. In Moscow, the mood was very different. Stalin knew the Soviet Union was vulnerable. His spies reported that the Americans were building stockpiles of nuclear bombs. His generals warned that if Washington decided to launch a surprise attack, the Red Army would be powerless to stop it. For Stalin, this was unacceptable. The Soviet Union had to find a way to balance the scales. If Stalin could not match America's bomb immediately, what could he do? Perhaps the Soviet Union could convince the world it had something stranger, something beyond science. And here the shadow of Nazi Germany loomed again. Stalin had seized German scientists and laboratories. He had heard the same rumors as the Americans, of the Horton flying wing, of the exotic drugs, of the grotesque psychic experiments, of devices like the Die Glocke, anti-gravity. What if he could take one of those myths and make it real? In the summer of 1947, newspapers across America were filled with a new phrase, flying saucer. It began in June when a pilot, Kenneth Arnold, reported seeing 9 strange objects flying at impossible speeds near Mount Rainier. His description, they flew like a saucer skipping on water, gave birth to the term. Within weeks, sightings multiplied. From Oregon to Texas, from Idaho to New Mexico, Americans looked up and swore they saw discs in the sky. Some say they were secret U.S. weapons. Others said they were visitors from another world. But in the climate of 1947, with nuclear fear and Cold War paranoia boiling, one thought lurked beneath them all. What if they were Soviets? Operation WWII was the Soviet counterpart to America's Operation Paperclip. Approximately 2,600 German scientists and engineers were relocated to work for the Soviets. As early as 1946, intelligence reports began filtering to the United States, detailing the existence of advanced propulsion systems mounted on flying wing designs for the Horton brothers' workshop. The Soviets claimed the flying saucers were their creation. The question exploded in 1947 in a desert town in New Mexico. A rancher named Mac Brazel discovered debris scattered across his land. Metallic scrap sticks, foil-like material. It wasn't like anything he had seen. He brought some to the local sheriff. The sheriff called the military, and on July 8, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release that stunned the world. They had recovered a flying disc. For one day, the story ran wild. The Army had confirmed what the newspapers had been printing all summer. Flying saucers were real. But then, just as quickly, the story changed. Within 24 hours, General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth presented reports with the remains of a weather balloon. The flying disc vanished. The mystery was buried. Or so the government hoped. Journalist Annie Jacobson's controversial book Area 51 tells the story. Her source claimed that Stalin, unable to match America's nuclear arsenal, decided to use terror instead. He commissioned a craft designed to look alien, possibly based on the Horton brothers' flying wing. He filled it with grotesquely altered children, product of Joseph Mengeles' experiments, and he sent it into American skies. The goal? To create panic, to make Americans believe they were under attack by beings not of this world, to sow confusion at the time when America felt untouchable. There is no proof of this story. Most historians dismiss it as sensational, but in the Cold War climate of 1947, everything was possible. And what's a fact is that the Soviets were spying on the Americans using the same weather balloons, so it's not a stretched possibility that they had devised a plan to instill fear in the American minds. A new front had been opened in the Cold War: propaganda and terror. To the public, Roswell became the first great UFO mystery, but to those inside Washington and Moscow, it was something else. In Washington, the debris were linked to Project Mogul, a classified balloon program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests, technologies Soviets had acquired from the Germans as well. In Moscow, the story looked different. To Stalin intelligence services, the message was simple: the Americans could spy on the Soviets too. Roswell created the myth of aliens, the perfect cover-up story for what was to come. Developed of secret airplanes like the U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird. But as the Korean War unfolded, America POWs returning home came back broken, brainwashed. Could the Soviets have furthered the Nazi experiments on mind control? A new era of illegal experiments began in America, under what it would be known as MK Ultra. One of the darkest episodes in the United States, and we only know about it because of a happenstance. It all started with the involvement of numerous Nazi scientists and the horrific research conducted in concentration camps. They experimented with LSD in an attempt to create a truth serum for interrogation purposes. In 1947, the US Navy established Project Chatter to further the study of the effects of LSD. Washington feared that the Soviets had succeeded in implementing mind-controlling techniques originally developed by the Nazis. Inside the newly formed CIA, Director Alan Dulles and technologist Sidney Gottlieb approved research focused on behavioral control, hypnosis, drugs, electroshocks, sensory deprivation. Anything that might force a confession, erase a memory, or compel someone to act against their will. They launched Project Bluebird in 1950, which was later renamed Artichoke in 1951. The project aimed to develop methods involving hypnosis, drugs, and forced addiction withdrawal to manipulate individuals into committing acts, including killing, while in an involuntary state of consciousness. They were basically trying to create a puppet. And make no mistake, this wasn't some obscure one-man operation. No, it was a multi-agency effort involving the CIA, FBI, the Navy, Air Force, and the Army. The scope of the project was detailed in a memo dated January 1952 that posed critical questions about the limits of human control. Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? At first, agents used cocaine, marijuana, heroin, mescaline, and LSD in volunteer Army and Navy personnel, but they increasingly saw LSD as the most promising drug. The subjects who left these projects were fucked with amnesia, resulting in faulty and vague memories of the experience and long-term altered behavior, some falling into depression and others into violence. In 1952, unsuspecting CIA agents were secretly drugged to study the effects of these substances without their knowledge. Records indicate agents kept on LSD for 77 consecutive days. That's 77 days of relentless hallucinations, enough to drive anybody to the brink of insanity. But that wasn't enough. Eventually, the experiments escalated. Subjects were injected with malaria, dengue, and other viruses just to observe what would happen when the disease interacted with LSD. A memo to the U.S. Army Brigadier General Paul Gaynor, who would be appointed to oversee the project, revealed the endgame of the CIA. The CIA seeks to establish control over the weaker and less intelligent segments of society, for potential agents such as defectors, refugees, prisoners of war, and others, to create assassins that unwillingly could assassinate a prominent, redacted politician or, if necessary, an American official. As each one of the government agencies involved in the research started branching out into several different venues of what could only be described as torture methods, the need to organize efforts aroused, and by 1953 the madness had to be centralized, and that gave birth to Project MK Ultra. If you ask yourself what the meaning of the name is, well, it doesn't mean anything. They were aleatory words chosen from a dictionary to cover up the true nature of the research. Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD in 1938 and discovered its powerful psychedelic effects in 1943 after accidental ingestion. In high dosage, it can induce mental breakdown by nightmarish hallucinations. By the 1960s, MK Ultra experiments had spread to university campuses, enrolling unsuspected victims under the disguise of novel psychiatric studies and hypnosis, all aimed at producing a sleeper killer agent. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a product of one of MK Ultra's experiments, as well as Charles Manson and his followers. The experiments went further, involving hospitals that gave massive dosage to unsuspected patients. The most famous cases occur in Canada at the Allen Memorial Institute, where psychiatrist Ewan Cameron induced his patients to coma and later filled them up with LSD. For months, mixing it up with electroshock therapy a few notches below electrocution. Survivors' lives were destroyed, leaving the hospital in zombie-like states. Many others died. Operation Midnight Climax, run by narcotic agent George Hunter for the CIA, used prostitutes to drug unsuspected clients who were recorded via two-way mirrors. At Edgewood Arsenal, they tried LSD, nerve agents, and meth on 7,000 soldiers, searching for non-lethal incapacitators. None of them were informed they were being used as guinea pigs. The study went into feeding school kids aged 7 and up with doses of different drugs to study if they could induce impaired mental development. MK Ultra ran for 20 years. Project MK Ultra was uncovered as a byproduct of the Watergate investigations. Know that what we know comes from files wrongly archived as financial records, which is estimated only reflects about 1% of the project's scope. Everything else was destroyed by the CIA before it got exposed. Project MK Naomi and MK Search dealt in producing alien-like abduction experiences involving LSD, but minimal documentation survives. How much MK Ultra altered American society is impossible to calculate. A measure of its reach could be assessed by how much LSD was used. The CIA at some point purchased the whole worldwide production of LSD for several years. That was enough to microdosage the entire population of the United States several times over for years to come. But the mind control war didn't end with LSD and the torture of American population at hands of their own government. Project Stargate ventured into the more esoteric venues of the human mind. That we will cover in the next episode of the Mind Control Wars.